Thanks, Mike, for sparing time to talk to us. And I'm just going to sort of start on this theme of a fractured world and begin by asking you what led to this fracture. Which are the warning signals we missed? And what could we have done better to prevent the kind of fracture that everyone is talking about?
Well, I think, I should mention some of what I'm going to say comes from a book that Gordon Brown and Mohammed Alarian and I just wrote, which has the title Permacrisis. So I think what's going on is, a very confusing world. The reason we wrote the book was we were trying to help people orient themselves in this world. So we have increasingly frequent crises and shocks being delivered to the global economy from multiple sources. Climate change, geopolitical tensions, pandemics, 2 wars underway, maybe more, and, an occasional financial crisis thrown in. So that's kind of one level. And then we have major structural changes going on underneath that have changed the way the global economy functions. The supply side is much different than the 30 or 40 years we've just gone through, in which basically we had unlimited additions of productive capacity delivered to the global economy with deflationary consequences.
Right. I'm going to pick up on the phrase structural change and what you seem to suggest, Mike, that we are not going back to an old normal. There is a new normal that we have to deal with. And it should kind of keep us awake at night because the human condition at this stage doesn't look particularly good. So what do you say to people who say that, look, we just had a run of bad luck, COVID happened, and maybe the Middle East has always been a difficult region. But what do you say to them?
So what we say to that is that misses the underlying structural shifts. So perhaps the easiest way to describe it to you is the central banks confronted inflation for the first time in literally 30 years. And so they bet that the cause of that was an excess demand condition because of supply disruptions associated with the pandemic. And they waited, and eventually those things, they subsided, but they did not solve the problem. And we had inflationary pressures, and they moved to raise interest rates very rapidly and to levels we hadn't seen in ages to try to rein in inflation. What I say to many people in the audience or in financial markets, there is a very powerful tendency to think we're going back to where we were, and it's very unlikely. I think the chances of us going back to a world, remember, after the great financial crisis, there was a decade in which we had zero nominal interest rates, negative real interest rates, and very large infusions of liquidity into the system and inflation below targets. And so ask yourself the question, are we going to go back to that world after the inflation fight is over? And I think the answer is clearly no. We are going to have higher real interest rates, higher costs of capital, higher sovereign debt levels, big investment programs associated with sustainability. It's just a completely different world. And I think part of the reason we wrote the book was, mindsets tend to be determined by the world you came from rather than the world you're entering. And we're trying to say this looks very different from what we're used to.
Right. So let's get to the fixes for this. How do we start to fix this problem now that we recognize that there is a kind of a structural shift? We are not going back to the old normal. Where do we begin? What are the most sort of positive trends that you see that might kind of address these fractures meaningfully over a period of time?
So we can't fix them all. That is, we lived in a world, with enormous growth in the emerging economies and a world whose global economy was constructed essentially on efficiency and comparative advantage criteria and nothing more. We're not going back there. the overlay of national security into the economic policy all over the place, but prominently in the United States, China tensions, they're not going to go away. But what we can do is learn to operate in a more complicated environment and prevent the complete fracturing of the global economy, what you might call excess collateral damage. And that's the direction that we tried to go in talking about the book. One other thing I will say, we do have serious supply side constraints. They're probably not as evident or important here in India, which is growing at a high rate, has the highest potential growth of any major economy in the world. There's an extraordinarily well-built sort of digital economy still in development and so on. But we need a productivity surge in the developed world and in much of the world that's aging, or we're going to have serious problems that range from fiscal to, debt overhangs, dependency ratios out of control, and so on. We have technological and scientific tools that will enable us to solve that problem. So the kind of the third piece, the third leg of the stool, Abheek, is we need to use those tools effectively to produce very powerful changes in the kind of growth dynamics that we're experiencing.
Right. One of the tools you're presumably referring to is this entire revolution in generative AI, and
yes.
It sort of kind of took us by surprise, I think, in its rapidity in which it suddenly sort of made its presence felt. There's also a sort of a downside to this for economies like India, who depend on low to mid-end services, things like call centers, things like coding. What do you say to people? I mean, where does the balance lie? You're looking at potential job losses in some economies, but you're also looking at major productivity surges. Will there be a fundamental asymmetry in the beginning where the West will kind of gain more from the AI revolution and we will be kind of left behind and have to catch up?
I don't think so. I think if you study the way the entrepreneurial ecosystems have worked in India, they've solved local problems. I don't think the Gen AI, episode or era that we're entering now, and we are entering it, is a period of experimentation and exploration, will be targeted at exactly solving problems. And they won't be the same when you cross boundaries. So we have a productivity problem, of a certain kind, like labor shortages. That's probably not what's going on here. The reason Gen AI is so powerful is pretty easy to describe. One, it's the first AI that switches domains in a human-like way. That's just unbelievably important because it means basically it can land anywhere in the economy. And the other one is that it's accessible. I mean, ChatGPT, when it was introduced a little more than 12 months ago, had 100 million users in the first 2 months. That's because anybody can talk to this thing and move on. So when I look at it, I think that the important thing to kind of close with on this subject, Abheek, is there's a very powerful automation bias in the way people think about Gen AI. It's coming for our jobs. And it comes from the history of artificial intelligence. Alan Turing said we should assess our progress in AI by asking, can we produce a machine that when a human speaks with a machine, that human thinks they're talking to another human? And that's called the Turing test. And we do benchmark AIs against human performance. But it's this next step that's so dangerous, which is, well, once the AI exceeds average human performance, regardless of what it is, image recognition, speech recognition, conversation, then let's replace the human. That's the step that's wrong. Okay? That when you look closely at where AI should be deployed, it's as a powerful digital assistant or collaborator to people and systems, importantly systems. Political leaders have to make trade-offs, difficult trade-offs, and so there's for those who want it to happen fast, it feels a little bit slower. But when I compare this to, 15 years ago when I was chairing a commission on growth and development and working with people all over the world, including here in India, the awareness about the nature of the challenge and what we all had to do to solve it was very low. And that's not true anymore. I mean, you basically can't find any place in the world that isn't thoroughly engaged. That doesn't solve the problem completely, but it's certainly a critical first step. So, but bottom line, straight answer to the question is, I think by and large, with an overlay of practicality, people are engaged in trying to solve the most important problems that we have.
I'm going to end the session with just a little bit on how companies are doing on this front, since you talked about climate change. And there's this big thing about ESG and so forth. And there is a strong view that ESG really hasn't worked out the way it was meant to be. It's just something trendy, a fad that has spawned an entire industry of consulting around it. How do you convince corporates to adopt more sustainable practices?
Well, my sense is that in every corner of the world there are companies who are aggressively pursuing business strategies and plans and missions that are well aligned with really important economic and social goals, including the climate change, and I admire them for it. And their engagement and innovation and creativity is crucial to solving the problem. Unfortunately, it's not everybody. There's another set of companies that view ESG as a marketing challenge, and that's a challenge that we face. In a sense, it's a measurement challenge, because the person on the street, the general public, needs to be able to distinguish between the companies that are advancing the cause and those that are basically trying to look good, but not doing much of anything. But on the whole, we do have pushback in America. It's some of it is just climate denial and other things, maybe for political reasons. But this other problem is real, and we need to deal. These measurement problems associated with climate change are really important. We need the offset markets to work. Okay, if offset markets are going to work, you have to know. If somebody invests in something and does something, that there's a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and we don't have that measurement system yet. That was an important part of the COP28 discussion.
Right, Mike. Unfortunately, much that I'd like to carry on speaking to you, we've come to the end of our time slot. And before the alarm goes off, let me thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank you for having me.
An honor and a privilege to be here with you, and take care and all the best.
Thank you.